Okay, what I want to look at this time is social structure, then we'll get into education. Finish off business actually last because business and education really can't be separated in Japan. Um, First, stratification. When you're looking at social status in Japanese society, there's it's everything changes twice. The first huge change is 1870s and 1880s under the Meiji Emperor. So when imperial rule replaces shogunate rule in the late part of the 19th century, if you would, this is when Japan becomes an imperial or colonial power very quickly. Uh, One of the main things that Meiji did, or more accurately, his set of senior advisors probably did, is to basically gut the whole logic of the samurai. And this made sense. Going everything we've seen this semester, already you can figure that the imperial family and, if you would, Kyoto had no love lost for the samurai and what you might call the Edo shogunate, samurai runs everything logic. So that they basically, as I mentioned when we are talking about history, they get rid of them in the 1870s, 1880s. Now you don't, eliminate them. What you do is you move them and they become your officer corps of the military. But this gives them something to do, keeps them out of trouble, and most importantly, separates them from plain political power or regional power in the same way they had, for the last, 1,500 years prior to that. Very clever move. Didn't work out quite the way they figured it would, given World War, especially World War II, but, whatever. The other thing that happens is post 1945. Um, I would actually argue before the end of World War II, say 1944 through, say, early 1950s, 1951, 1952, in other words, when the Korean War goes into truce. What you have is a huge seismic shift, for lack of a better term, in Japanese society. Um, this is the closest thing I can think of to actually a period of cultural change that you can actually label the last, I would say almost 2,000 years. It's certainly not dramatic by Chinese standards, but by Japanese standards, it's totally earth shattering. And what happens is with the end of World War II, with enormous loss of life and basically the destruction of all the urban areas in Japan, with the exception of Kyoto, just get wiped off the face of the map. So a large part of the population is either destroyed or certainly displaced. The society comes near collapse. Starvation is actually not uncommon in 1945, 46. And to be honest, the occupying forces, the Americans, and to a lesser extent the Brits, Australians, I'm trying to help out, but the level of destruction was beyond. I don't know that it was beyond what they thought would happen, but I think they were so shocked at the lack of Japanese government ability to deal with any of this stuff. The Japanese government basically from 1941 to 1945 just goes around like an ostrich with its head in the sand. They just keep on pretending nothing's happening, and they totally don't make any preparations for any of this stuff. The whole period of the firestorm, the giant urban fire attacks of 1944, 45. The various cities do absolutely nothing to prepare themselves for them. They do nothing to prepare their citizens for them, and just everyone just burns. Um, for lack of a better term, I'd say it's insane. But in Japanese society, it has a certain weird logic to it. Sort of like if you pretend something isn't happening, then maybe it won't happen. So World War II ends, and basically what comes out of this is the whole system of samurai control is now discredited. People don't believe that the governments that they had from, say, 1900 to 1945 really had a clue. It's not so much that they were bullshitters, but they didn't know what they were doing. They were just, for lack of a better term, you could argue they were pretty much incompetent to deal with the realities of the world, especially in the World War II period. And so what happens is World War II is now ended. Japanese society is basically almost at the Stone Age. They're back to where they were 2,000 years earlier. And so what happens is the society individually and collectively decides that they're gonna pick their boots up and they're gonna go back and try it all over again. but they're not going to remake the mistakes they did of the period from the 1870s on. And one of the huge, stunning changes is that of what Japanese society does post World War II to sort of reinvigorate itself and come up with a new version of what it is. Because you have to remember, unlike Europe, which had the Marshall Plan, so the United States, for example, invest huge amounts of money in a lot of Europe to sort of, bring them back from the destruction of World War II. No one invests any money in Japan. Japan becomes successful by the 1960s, 70s entirely on their own cognizance, and with no one helping and no one supporting, and until the early 1950s, no one even interested. So it's a mind-blowing situation when you realize this is the second time they've done this in less than 100 years. First would be the 1870s. One of the huge changes that occurs in all this is the, you might call, collapse of the stratification system, with the exception of a small group, which we'll get into. What happens is basically Japan sort of re-identifies themselves as saying, okay, with the exception of others, and we'll get into that a little later, everyone's basically part of the middle class. So, especially if you live anywhere near a small town or anything larger than a small town, so anything even vaguely semi-urban, you're middle class. You have different sort of pecking orders in the middle class. You might be a guy that's works in a shop. You might be the shop owner. You might be a company that manufactures stuff. So different folks will have different sort of micro levels, but they're still all considered middle class. And this is the post World War II Japan, is the idea that everyone basically is middle class. Now there's sort of a qualifier to this. Farmers never really get plugged into the middle class. To a certain extent, it's not that they're considered less, they're just considered different because one, they're in the country, i.e. they're rural, but two, they're also providing food. And one thing that Japan always did, and still does today, is Japanese don't provide enormous amounts of food of sort of mediocre quality. So if classic example would be rice. You go to, I don't know how much rice they produce in California, but it's a ton of rice. So if I go into a store even here in Nevada and I want to get rice, I can get, huge bags of California rice, Calrose and all the rest of those, just like I could back in Honolulu. And it's, it's not bad. It's okay. It's typical of what you might call, industrial level agriculture. In Japan, what you're going to find is there's very little, almost none of that. In fact, they import that type of rice. What you're going to find in Japan is every family, every, maybe cooperative in a village produces rice. And in Japan, everyone's convinced the rice actually tastes different if it's from one of these different places. So everyone's little, rice field is considered to be unique. And to be honest, when you get used to tasting it, I argue there's some truth to that. And so what you get in Japan is you get, maybe 1,000 small level farmers in a little district. Even around Kyoto, I would bet there's got to be at least 1,000 rice farmers. Now you're not going to buy a 500-pound bag of rice. What you're going to buy is 5 pounds, maybe 10 pounds of rice from this guy that's just down the street or the other side of the lake or whatever. And people pay that price because they want the taste of that particular rice. So Japanese are, put it in a real blunt way, Japanese are really picky when it comes to food. And so farmers were always seen as almost like crafts. Yeah, they were craftspeople. They crafted food that was good to eat. So they weren't really part of the middle class per se, but they were certainly sort of not, lower class. The whole idea of peasants and serfs, which existed in some way, shape, or form really until the end of World War II, is gone with the end of World War II, and it's replaced by this whole sort of middle class perception. Now, there's one group that doesn't fit in that, and that's the named families. So let's take a little quick visual jaunt here. Okay, this is another image from that marriage that we happened to bump into at Sumiyoshi Taisha in Osaka. So these folks are all part of the imperial family. I have no idea who they are. I have no idea what the rank is. I have no idea what the relationship is to the imperial family per se. But what I can guarantee is because these folks are who they are, that if you look at them carefully, the guys would have on their, let's see, you can never put on the left or the right, left-hand side. On the left-hand side, like this guy's jacket, you can't see it, but there would be a small pin. And that pin would be the crest of that part of the family. And so they wear this all the time. The women do the same thing. They would have it as a crest somewhere near where she's got that sort of corsage thing, unless that's the crest there. That seems a little large. Usually it's pretty small. It's like it looks sort of like a company pin, but it's not. And you're expected to wear that in public all the time. These are one of what they call the crested families. I can't remember how many Moln there are. The Moln is the actual, if you would, logo, the crest of that particular, clan. So these folks would all be by virtue of, being here and being that ceremony, and by definition, I pretty much have to be crested. So this group is the elite. They're not the monetary elite. These folks closest parallel would be maybe like the branches of the British royal family. They've got chunks of status and prestige. They're seen as totally different. They pretty much intermarry within their own collection, but they're a very small part of the society, less than something minuscule percentage of 1%. And they are still the elite in Japanese society. So if you would, what happens is Japanese society in some ways has gone back to its sort of shogunate period. You've got your actual imperial elite, which was in Kyoto with no power. In 2026, 2027 Japan, what you have is an imperial network elite that has no power. And unlike their British or European counterparts, people don't look at them for status, or I should say, taste and style and such like that. These guys have nice suits. Obviously, they're not, salaryman suits. But by the same token, they're not, this guy here and this guy here aren't wearing some, $15,000 Gucci suits. If they were Yakuza, that might be, but these guys aren't. So there's nothing that makes this group, there's nothing that makes the rest of Japanese want to copy this group or emulate this group. So you're not going to find these guys in social media being brought up in like TikTok or Instagram or something like that. Oh, look at the new style that, she's wearing. Everyone should do this, So that part's gone. That part doesn't exist. To be honest, I'm not sure that part ever existed. There was always a lot of distance between the imperial entourage, if you would, in Kyoto and the rest of the population. And that's returned. So these guys, if you would, survived World War II pretty much intact. They never had money. They never had political power in the 20th century. So, post World War II, they just sort of stayed and did their own thing. And given the Japanese reverence for sort of structured traditional authority, everyone just sort of was okay with that because, they weren't putting any onus on the society. It wasn't like the taxpayer paid a huge amount of money to keep these guys in the style they were accustomed to, unlike the British, I should point out. So they sort of, they're still there. These are the crested families. There was a couple of really good works. I think I've got them in the bibliography. A couple of really good works done in the 70s and 80s, looking at these crested families and how they function in what you might call modern middle-class Japanese society. And real good, really well written and very interesting. One of the ladies at UH Manoa was really big. This was her, her kuleana was looking at the crested families. So these exist. I've actually met. Come to think of it, I met a member of one of the families. Come to think of it, but they generally don't get involved in commercial activities. They stay out of politics almost entirely. So they sort of like operate in their own. They're back in sort of a Kyoto-like vacuum, I guess, for lack of a better term. So this is your only elite group. This is typical of modern Japanese society. This is the city councilors, at least that's what I was told. This is the city councilors at Takayama. They're opening up the Matsuri, the festival here. And so this is the opening up ceremony. She's doing the pronouncement here. Notice one, it's all men. Well, it's the one lady at the end here. But there's the ladies are off to the side. So you've got, I have no idea what she's supposed to be, but she's like a secretary, some sort of assistant. then you've got this lady here who's sort of reading off the cards. But the players are obviously guys. These guys are the senior political, social leaders of the town of Takayama, and I suppose probably the countryside around it. Um, and it's an interesting group of folks. They're totally, typically Japanese. There's nothing unusual about these. All these guys would be considered middle class, as would this guy here. Who actually has, if you notice, if I zoom in, he's got some sort of a pin. I would be willing to bet that's actually the city council or something like that, some sort of city authority pin. And again, she's the sort of classic woman in position of suburban, she's an assistant of some sort. That type of hat is real typical in Japan for women who are supposed to help people do stuff. So if these guys took the yukatas off, you'd find that they have the same pin on the lapel of their jacket. And they're different there's different representatives of power. Usually where they are, I won't make that assumption. I don't know how these guys play the game, so I'm not sure if the guy in the center has the most power or not. It's very Japanese that they all have scissors and they all cut the ribbon at the same time. That's so Japanese. That's so wa when you think about it. Versus the American, where you give someone important a big scissor and they cut the ribbon. Not in Japan. The whole city, we'll just say county or city council cuts the ribbon at the same time. And actually, she was doing a 1, 2, 3, and then they went and cut it at the same time. They did a pretty decent job, actually. And so what you've got is they're all middle class. They have different amounts of power in the town of Takayama. I'm willing to bet that all of them, maybe with one exception, I have no idea who it would be, but I'd be willing to bet almost all of them are from Takayama. For some reason, I'd say he might be an exception because you're going to get, occasionally like whoever's in charge, like IT or something like that, might come from somewhere else. And I would suspect that at some point the central government probably appoints some folks, but the rest of these folks are probably all from there. And so this is Japanese society, in the last half of the 20th and the first half of the 21st century. The vast majority of the population is seen as being similar. Now, no, they're not the same because they're different people. These guys would have different oil, but they're linked to. They are Kobun. They've got Kobun that link to them because their status in the society and also their status in Takayama, etc. And so they're all individuals, and they're all part of individual networks. In many cases, running parallel to each other, and probably in some places in conflict with each other, in the sense that if his group gets ahead, then his group didn't. But nonetheless, they're a package deal. This is Japanese society. It's middle class. What that does is, of course, for folks outside of Japan, it makes it very difficult to figure out what people actually have power, because you don't see a lot of the identifiers that you would in other societies. For example, in Chinese society, the way people dress is usually a pretty good indicator of where they are in the feeding chain. You look at these guys, good luck figuring out who's what in the feeding chain. And so this is modern Japanese society. It is very much not classless, but it's certainly the vast majority of the population considered middle class. Now that is just defined, and of course here we actually a good example. This is the town of Takayama, big tourist attraction, cute town, famous for its sake and a bunch of other stuff. So it's this is not a normal Japanese town. This is a successful 21st century surviving even in the modern world Japanese town. Rural areas would be entirely different. And the key here is we'll see this is a huge problem in Japan, because what this means is if you want to get ahead, if you want to stay in the game, you can't do that in the countryside. You can only do that if you're in the city or the nearest town. So there's this giant magnet that just draws people to urban areas for any sort of success, whether it be educational success, political, social success, whatever. So in some way, shape, or form, in a weird way to think, all these guys are actually sort of competing with each other, I suppose you could think. But that's not the way they would see it. And to be honest, that's not really the way I sort of see it either. So this is modern Japan. there's that small elite doing their own thing, like Sumiyoshi Taisha, and then there's Japan. Okay, now the key thing with a lot of this, and this has to do with the complexities of again the way Japanese do social networking. Because Japanese social network by virtue of neighborhoods, by virtue of school, which school and stuff like that. This vertical alliance system means that you do not have. It's the in some ways it's like the mirror opposite of the American system. Right now I live in a, to put it bluntly, lower class, mobile home settlement, community in Carson City. I just moved in here, less than a year ago. And to be honest, it's not bad. The folks are pretty nice. But it's definitely, you're in the bottom end of the system. The vast majority of the population in this mobile home park is Latinos. They are Latinos because that's the bottom end working group in Nevada, especially northern Nevada, just like it is, in places like Lahaina. So what you find is the folks here are on the edge. They have a hard time making rent every month. They don't have a lot, and typical of the United States, especially here, is what you find. There's interesting patterns of semi-social segregation. Across the street, there's another mobile home park. Down the road, there's another mobile home park. If you jump across the main street, which is about 500 meters away, on the other side is a very nice middle upper class subdivision. So the mobile homes here range from 80 to maybe $100,000. The houses across the street range from $600 to $900,000. So this is typical of social segregation. Now, what you're going to find is the folks in this mobile home park probably don't know anyone in that subdivision. The folks in that subdivision don't know anyone in this mobile home park. Some folks in this mobile home park might work as gardeners and stuff for the folks in that subdivision, but they don't interact with each other. They're not part of the same social network. They're entirely separate. This is what we call horizontal social orientation, where your position in society is defined by your social economic rank. And in American society, and here's a classic example, is where you live is a definition of that. The neighborhood that I'm in this mobile home park is definitely a lower middle class, the lower middle class at best, but certainly lower class neighborhood. And that's fine. That is what it is. But that's the way Americans define themselves, and this is why Americans move so frequently. If you become successful, we call it upward mobility. And so what you do is you move to a new residence and you upscale where you live. You see this classically in Hawaii with the idea that you start out in Kapolei, and then maybe you move to a nicer place in Pearl City, or Kaneohe or something like that, and eventually you end up in Kahala or something. And also what happens, of course, the reverse takes place. If your family or you suddenly lose your job and your company disappears, then all of a sudden you move out of Kahala and you find yourselves in a two-story walk up in Kapahulu. So that's where local society in Hawaii is actually in some ways becoming more and more mirrored. It wasn't. Old neighborhoods like Kaimuki, for example, are very mixed in terms of socioeconomic, value of residents. There was very much closer to here, which makes sense. You have to remember one of the largest ethnic groups in Hawaii is Japanese. So this idea of social networking horizontally is very much the mainland United States. This idea of social segregation, which is also visible in distance, and also in terms of interaction. People in different socioeconomic groups don't interact with people in other socioeconomic groups. In Japanese society, that's totally not the case. In Japanese society, it's vertical orientation. So in Japanese society, that group of folks, again, those images of the kids we saw in Takayama and the uniform kids, it's very likely that those kids, their parents make different amount of money. And so they're different, in American society, they'd be different social ranks. But in Japanese society, because they're in the same neighborhood, they're going to the same school, they've grown up together, they're actually networked in a social network. And that's going to persist through the rest of their lives. Some of them are going to be more successful, some are going to be less successful. But that's not going to change who they hang out with. So in Japanese society, what happens is that there's almost no class identity. You don't dress to fit your neighborhood, if you want to think of it that way. You don't dress to fit the group you're a part of. You would dress to match your friends that you're in a social network with. So when you bump into Japanese, you really have no idea how much they're worth, because to Japanese that's not relevant. It's what your social network is. So class identity really doesn't exist to a large part in Japan, more so than any society I can actually think of. It's not that they're egalitarian, but it's just that their idea of social status and social structure is based on social networks, not on socioeconomic position. Having said that, of course, there's a whole set of groups that don't get to play that game. The first would be anyone who's from outside. This goes back to what I was mentioning last time, it's like geosociobiology thing. So Japanese that are coming back to Japan, Japanese that left Japan that are coming back, Japanese that move from one part of the country to another. So Japanese that move from, say, Tokyo or Osaka or someplace like that, and end up in Hakodate or Sapporo in Hokkaido in the north, would be pretty much isolated from anyone else up there. They would still have ties with whoever they knew back, say, in Osaka. And so the whole group would, like folks that went to the same school together would still get together, and they might very well go up and visit and hang out up in the north in Hokkaido, in part just because it's something different. So it's fun to do with a group of folks you've known your entire life. But also because I bet at some point there's sort of sympathy for the member of their group that's now sort of in exile, if you want to think of it that way, by virtue of being stuck in the north. And it's very strong. In fact, Japanese will talk about this, being stuck somewhere where all of a sudden your entire network of people are now only available to you on social media, versus being able to do stuff with them together. So, Japanese get very sympathetic and feel very sad for folks that somehow get dislocated from their social network, especially physically in terms of distance. So that geosociobiology and all the ways that I mentioned last time that plays out is obviously a group that's out of stratification because they're out of the system. They're just not, they're aliens in the sort of the classic sense. And the other two group of aliens would be the Ainu Okinawans. Okinawans, as I mentioned last time, Okinawa has been part of the Japanese, I guess, empire, for lack of a better term, since the 1600s when the samurai from the south, Kyushu, went and took over the Satsumas, went and took over the Okinawan islands, the Ryukyus, and made them into subservient territories. Okinawans from these, late 15, early 1600s into essentially end of World War II, were not Japanese. I mean, it was part of the Japanese country, but they were considered basically the closest American equivalent would be slaves. In fact, they were slaved right into the mid-late 19th century. Then they become, basically another form of buraku min, of essentially untouchable. So, Okinawans would never marry into a Japanese family. Okinawans would never get a decent job. In fact, even today, Okinawans are not going to get a job in the government or a large corporation, unless one, it's in Okinawa, and two, that they become sort of like the token Okinawan to prove that the company's actually very liberally minded. But you're not going to find them standing in a row along with those councilors in the Takayama City Council. The other group is the Ainu, and again, that's your really would be in many ways actually is the original Japanese, but they're not ethnic Japanese. They're the remnants of what sort of what would be called Native Americans if they're on the other side of the Pacific. They're the folks that are tied into your Siberian, Inuit, and other Alaskan populations. They don't look at all Japanese. They look very Native American. They look Inuit to me. They look exactly the same. I can't tell them apart at all. So they're totally segregated. They live on reservations, largely almost entirely. I think there's one reservation in North Honshu, but all the rest of them are in Hokkaido. And they're seen as a tourist attraction. Japanese go up there to go see an Ainu. It's just like you go see a bear. So they're totally out of the system. Very small number of population, especially compared to say Okinawans. What happens in the 19th, 20th century is large numbers of Koreans especially once Japan takes over Korea in 1911. And then also Chinese ethnic populations, as Japan takes over parts of China from the 1930s on, get imported at gunpoint into Japan as slave labor, exactly the same as Nazi Germany did in the 30s and 40s, in exactly the same way. Large numbers of them just sort of die. There's still a huge legal thing going on about Korean and Chinese comfort women that were brought in intentionally as prostitutes for the Japanese army in the from the 1911 period on, who were never given any compensation. And as I think I mentioned, I was talking about history. Unlike the German need to apologize for the excesses of the Nazi period, the Japanese were never made to and still have never apologized for the excesses they did that actually go back to the 1890s, early 20th century period. So they've never actually apologized for the fact that they imported millions of folks of Korean and Chinese as slave labor, and ended up killing most of them. The remnants are still in Japan. They're still totally aliens. You could be fourth generation Korean or Chinese, born and raised in Japan, only speak Japanese, but you still carry what would be called a green card in the United States. You're still considered an alien. And for example, if you're Korean and you do something wrong, God knows what that would be, but somehow the Japanese government decides you've done, could be something minor. It could be literally, like a speeding ticket. It's very possible the Japanese government will then deport you to Korea. Even though you have no relatives, no family, and your family left Korea in, say, 1911, you're still considered an alien. So they've never become Japanese. It just doesn't happen. Now, the other group that I hadn't talked about before would be the really derogatory term is ETA, but they're called Barakumin. This is a very complicated thing. No one's actually come up with a really good idea of how these folks became what they became. This is a group of Japanese that for some reason get dropped down socially. My suspicion would be that they were peasant serf populations in parts of Japan where the really ruling samurai took it on the chin. And for some reason or another, everyone decided that the peasants that worked for that group weren't really good to have around in any particular way. So they became, they're usually, the closest parallel would be in India would be the particular caste groups that are called untouchables. So what happened over the last, Barakumin had been around for at least 500 or 600 years. So what you find is folks are totally Japanese. They're not from somewhere else. So they don't fit any of the earlier groups I was talking about. They're totally ethnic Japanese, but they've been put in jobs or careers that regular Japanese won't touch. Now, traditionally, that was, mortuary stuff, in other words, dealing with dead people. Secondly, it was killing animals, butchering animals for meat and also for skins. And third was actually working skins. So, for example, if you go to Kobe, which has a large, they don't talk about it, but there's two pretty large ex-Barakumin communities. Again, Barakumin becoming illegal in 1945. When the Americans come into the occupation, they say, you guys can't do this type of caste system anymore. So they make this illegal. And of course, the Koseki registers that, get all burned out. So no one quote knows who, unquote, who anyone is, though they do. So the end result is that you end up with neighborhoods that were Barakumin neighborhoods that still are largely Barakumin neighborhoods, but you really can't tell unless you look around and two things. One is if you're on the tram, if you're on the trains, you notice who gets off the train and who doesn't. And you'll see that salarymen don't get off the train at those stops. Secondly, when you look at those particular places, what you'll see is there's a large number of places that repair or make shoes, or anything else, belts, bags, handbags, anything to do with leather working. Probably most striking is, at least in Kyoto, the one small area I know that's a Barakumin settlement, you can tell, because that's where they make all the drums that you use for various ceremonies and such. The drum skins, of course, are made of skin. So the only folks that traditionally would work those would be Barakumin, and that's still pretty much true in 2026. That part hasn't changed. Other ethnic Japanese would not be caught dead handling leather. Now, the weird thing is they have no trouble carrying a handbag or obviously wearing a pair of shoes or, for example, drumming on a taiko drum. So they're not having trouble using it, but somehow the idea of making it is still considered, it makes you an untouchable. The argument that they like to make is that in the Buddhist system, since you're dealing with death and dead animals and dead people, is that means that by definition you'll not reincarnate properly, which really strikes me as a really good example of sort of an excuse after the fact. The other thing that Barakamine did, um, and this of course gets depopularized in both manga but also in movies and stuff, is traditionally the group that are oftentimes called ninja, which really aren't. Yeah, they're not the way they're portrayed. But anyways, there were folks that were sort of like spies, assassins, etc. And they were actually clans. There were actually at least three clans that were involved in this activity. They were all Barakumin. Now, of course, in modern Japanese movies and manga and stuff, the ninja are, classic good Japanese, of high class families who are just doing sneaky stiff stuff. That's not true. The other thing that Barakumin got into early on is they were heavily involved in gambling. In Japanese society, both in the past and still today, this is also true in Korean and Chinese society, getting involved in the acting arts, not plastic arts. So, for example, if you're a sculptor or you do ceramics or carving jade or literature or something, those type of arts, that's very much a high class thing all throughout Asia. Those people have a lot of status and prestige. In fact, I'm willing to bet the imperial family, that's probably what they do. They probably do literature because that would be a very typical thing. But what you're going to find is that if you're involved in acting, now traditionally this would have been on the stage, but also now in the modern sense, this would be like TV. K-pop groups are a good example in Korea. Their Japanese counterparts. That's considered a very low status job. And in fact, that's exactly the same as it was in Europe, in fact, to a certain extent, even still today in a lot of Europe. If you're an actor or an actress or a musician or something like that, that's very low status. And that was traditionally was tied to prostitution. So a prostitute was in many cases someone who acted or sang on stage or did something like that, then also was available for sex, for a certain rate. And that was, in Europe, that was exactly the same as it is in Asia. So traditionally, anyone involved in any sort of stage stuff, and this is still very true today, that's incredibly low status. Some folks manage to sort of work their way out of it. And it doesn't mean they're not popular, but it does mean that, on one hand, you might, they might be like an idol in the sense that, you've got tons of followers and stuff like that. On the other hand, if you brought one home, and said, "Hey, I'd like to marry this lady," your family would go absolutely nuts. So it's that's not acceptable. Now, one of the other aspects of that then is gambling, which of course was the other big public thing to do, which usually in many ways was tied to things like like performance arts and such. Was also Barakumin Kuliana. That's something they were in charge of. So what this meant, among other things, especially in Japanese society, but also at least to a certain extent in Chinese society too, is tatau. Tattooing on the body becomes a form of marker of Barakumin, at least in Japan, becomes Barakumin status. And in most of Asia, tataus are very much something that you see with folks that are outside the norm. So in Japan, what you find is this becomes called the Yakuza, or at least that's what they are now. And that's been the term they've used for, I think, about the last 150 years or something like that. So what happens is they develop sort of surrogate clans, and there's a little more freedom of movement in them. But again, that makes in Japanese society, this becomes a social network. Your social network is the guys that you grew up with. You gamble with them. You become I'm not sure what you'd call the folks that actually run a gambling hall. They're not gamblers. But also like bars and such like that. Anything, here in Nevada it would be the classic saloon. The guys that run the saloon owner, the guys that are in the saloon, the guys that run the gambling tables. All those folks would be part of the same package, and they would all at each gambling hall, or each here would be called saloon, would all be part of one Yakuza family. And so that's, your Yakuza in Japan are an interesting group. They've become, post World War II, they've become very sort of ultra conservative. which they really weren't before because they were also on the outside. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, if you were part of the Kempetai, the Japanese secret police, they frequently would kill anyone with a tattoo on sight just because of the suspicion they had to be Yakuza. So these folks were really predated upon, I would argue, in the late 19th, mid 20th century. Post World War II, they grow. They always had a lot of power informally, but post World War II, they start to gain more visible power. Yakuza have sort of faded a little. Well, they haven't really faded. They've just become a little better at not being highly visible, because they're now, international crime syndicates, and you don't want. Last thing you want to do is try to fly to the, Hawaii. Well, actually, we have a lot of Yakuza here, but you very rarely will see old Yakuza, the guys with the tattoos, maybe missing one or two finger joints as apologies for mistakes they made in the past or whatever. I actually met a couple of those. One of our students about, almost 20 years ago. She was she was of a high-ranked Yakuza family, and she always had one or two bodyguards with her when she was a shaman. I don't think anyone else figured out who they were. I mean, the guy was really nice, funny guy to be with, but he had beautiful tattoo over, most of his arms, and his back was just a stunning piece of art. And it was missing his second. They call it the ring finger, but on the other hand, he was missing the first joint. I never got the story about what that was about. But he was like an old style, 1940 to 1970s Yakuza. Now what you're going to find is they're much more sophisticated and stuff like that, but they're still this, and they're still unacceptable to Japanese society. So unlike a lot of the movies where you see Yakuza sort of spun out as being these stylish guys with nifty glasses, Japanese, they're not acceptable in Japan. They run certain stuff because they're good at it. They've got a good grasp of it, and no one wants to argue with them. But it's sort of like quid pro quo. Everyone's learned to live with them, and the Yakuza in Japan are very good at not expanding outside of where they're supposed to be. And of course, I mentioned before, non-Japanese are in the sense of Japanese outside of Japan, especially here in Hawaii, are also, of course, not members of the system. They're not part of the stratification, and they can't be. Okay. So let's do a little bit of the education. We'll finish off. Education. I mentioned this before. Traditionally, education in Japan was, and many societies, Japanese were the same, was this idea of the apprentice. So basically, you study under someone and you follow them around and you copy them and emulate them. Eventually, if you're good enough, you turn into that same position. The most famous, there's a really good work that I think her name is Dolby, did in the 1980s, I'm going to say, on geisha, more accurately, Michael, in terms of how you became a geisha. She actually was pretty good. It was a good anthropological study. She actually became an assistant, an understudy to a geisha, for I think about a year and a half. So in some areas in Japanese society, you'll still see this. You'll see this you'll still see this in some art forms. If you're going to learn how to play an instrument, like a koto, you're going to do that same thing. They're not going to teach you in the way that I learned how to play instruments. You're going to sit there and you're going to basically apprentice under someone who's playing the koto, and you're going to watch them. And from them, when they're not around, you're going to practice the fingerings and eventually learn how to do it. If you're going to be a carpenter, even today in Japan, you might have gone to a trade school, but whoever's actually going to take you as an understudy, as an apprentice, will expect you to learn everything from them. So you're going to learn all their ways of doing stuff. So carpentry in Japan is unique in the sense that every carpenter in Japan learned their skills from another carpenter in Japan. And so in many ways, when you watch one of these guys working, you're actually watching 300 or 400 years of carpentry techniques that are going to be unique to that network of folks. You're not going to find two carpenters doing the same thing. They're going to do the same thing differently. It might be in little ways, but that's because of this. So that was the traditional system. That's largely, it's not completely disappeared, but it's rapidly disappearing. Contemporary modern Japanese don't have I would argue, the time or patience for that type of system. And to be honest, I don't think the society really, the society doesn't give enough status and prestige to folks that do that. So why would you pursue that all the years that you have to spend when there's going to be nothing, no payout at the end, you might say, cynically. What happens, as I mentioned, I think before, is that 19th century Japan, 1860s, especially at 1870s, 1880s, Japan decides it's going to become a surrogate European country. So what happens is, among other things, they literally just arbitrarily say, okay, a compulsory public education, which of course the vast majority of Japanese were illiterate. So what you have is compulsory public education. Everyone's going to be literate. We're going to have a school system. Because they limited amount of money, they set it up on the German model, which, as I mentioned when I was talking about the kids, you have one route, if you want to think of it that way, which leads to higher education. You have another route which leads to vocational education. I should point out that even today in Japan, and this is true in all of Asia, bachelor's degrees are terminal degrees. Very few people, unless they're going to get involved in academic research, would bother with advanced degrees. And it's not going to get you promoted. It's not going to get you a better job. It's not going to get you a pay raise. So it's stupid to do. And this is actually true, and for a lot of Europeans, in a lot of European societies, for example, even German society, you don't see the fascination with advanced degrees. And to be honest, a lot of Chaminad's revenue stream, which is based on masters and doctoral programs and stuff like that, would fall flat on its face in Japan or in Europe, because you're just not going to find people who are willing to put the money or the time into it, because there's no advantage to them. It's not going to. It doesn't give you any better career path. It's a waste of your time. So what you get is basically in Japan, if you do well, you get into the higher education, which gets you into a university, which gives you a bachelor's degree. If you don't do as well, or sad to say, if you're just at rural schools, in small towns and stuff like that, the schools aren't going to have that good of teaching, and they're not going to have the same support system available, especially in jukus. So those kids are just never going to test out well enough to get into good universities. So they're pretty much going to all be routed to vocational education. Now the other thing is, again, but you have to remember, like those counselors in the Takayama Council, cutting that ribbon. I have no idea how many of those folks had bachelor's degrees, but it might be less than half. Because again, there's no loss in status for not having a bachelor's degree. Having a college degree doesn't mean you're somebody automatically. So someone who vocationally went into a vocational high school and now has a successful car repair shop or something like that is at least of equal status to someone who graduated from second or third rate university and got a bachelor's degree in something. So it's a totally different system than the American system. It's actually typical in all of Asia, which is one reason why you want to be very careful. If you have advanced degrees, you want to be very careful who you talk about that to. In Asia, you're generally okay in China in urban areas, because as long as you're dealing with folks that are sort of sophisticated urbanites, because they're not interested in having done that themselves. They will get uncomfortable if you try to make any noise about the fact that you're Dr. So-and-so, because the immediate implication is they're not. And that'll really piss them off. So you don't want to go around. I would argue that flaunting your degree status in Asia is a stunningly bad idea and has absolutely no positive feedback to it. But what you're going to find is they don't care. They don't care if you have that degree as long as you don't make any noise about it. But that's also not going to give you any status or prestige because you've got those degrees. And also what you're going to find is the folks you interact with might not have degrees at all, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have less status. So it's just it's a different set of players, a different set of games, and plays out entirely separately. The universal testing is how you do things. The Ministry of Education in Japan sets up universal tests. And in China, they have the same thing, especially for elementary, middle school, and high schools. Everyone takes the same exams. They take them on the same days of the year. And it's the suicide rate just shoots up, dramatically. So everyone's going through the same system. So all those kids we saw in Takayama are going to take all the tests in the same day. They're going to take the same test. They're taking the same test as every other kid that year, say the 6th grade test, in the entire country of Japan. And they're then going to be scored relative to everyone else that took the test. So in Japan, and this is the same in China, same in China. The 3 main tests that you have are kindergarten, in terms of your initial elementary school, what type of elementary school you get into, um, vocational or sort of, higher ed. Sixth grade, which then routes you into middle school, which one you're going to go into. Eighth grade, which routes you into high school, which type you're going to go into. And these are the three big ones. At the end of that, when you graduate from high school, then of course you take the university exams, and that's unique to each university. Each university has its own exam it gives. They give them on the same. They give them like they actually don't give them on the same day. They give them like a 2 or 3 week period. And I think about it. That's probably so people can take multiple exams. So, anyways, so that's the system in basically in Asia. It's not unique to Japan, a lot of it. What you find is that the part that becomes, well, Chinese do the same thing. To be honest, I don't know about Koreans. I wouldn't be too surprised if they have the same thing. In fact, I'm sure they probably do. But in Japan, they call these jukus. So not surprisingly, this is one of the few areas where I think Japanese get pretty practical and pretty pragmatic, because they probably have to. Certainly true in China, is that you're expected to, if everyone's taking the same exam, then either you can just take the exam based on what and the fact that you've studied and you've done your homework and you don't get any sleep till like 1 o'clock in the morning, it's the sixth grade. Or if you're clever, what you do is you go to a tutoring group. Now, in China, these tend to be private tutors, or, well, they have jukus, but there's a lot more what you would call just tutors, individuals who actually will give you, extra training, extra drill. In Japan, these cram schools are a huge business. They're actually tied to the education system. And so what happens is, on one hand, they're private schools. If you go to teach Japanese, English in Japan, the groups that are still recruiting fairly heavily are the cram schools, the Yobikujuku. And so, what they do is when kids are done with school, I think school gets out around 3 o'clock usually. What they do is they don't go home. What they do is they then spend maybe a half an hour, getting something to eat. And then they go to a juku, they go to a cram school. And they'll be in the juku till maybe 8 or 9 p.m., repeating the same drill that they did that week, that they're doing that week in the regular school. So they're going, private schools in Japan are, and public schools are the same thing. There's no difference because they all have to take the same exam. Doesn't matter what type of school you went to. So you might as well go to a public school if it's any good. But what you do is you gain your competitive advantage on the rest of your classmates, both in your school and nationally, by the amount of time you spend in the cram school. So the cram schools are ranked in terms of, what percentage of folks that went to their cram school got into a good university, You can sort of figure out how that plays out. And so what they do is they provide the second level of drilling, but especially in Japan, this is true of all of Asia. This is all rote stuff. So, Japanese learn a level of geography that I might be able to keep up with most of it since I have a doctorate in geography, but there would be areas that I would be totally missing. Like, what's the actual length of the Amazon River? I mean, I have no idea. I would just Google it. But in Japan, you memorize all that stuff. Japanese generally go through English. They've had English since the 4th grade. I think it's 4th grade. And that, especially if you want to go to university, you have to have English. But it's all memorized English. So Japanese basically memorize an American dictionary or an English dictionary. And this is why Japanese, if you write out English to them, they can usually puzzle it out. But if you speak it to them, they can't speak English because they've memorized it. They can say rote phrases. So it's very much like playing with a robot. It's not even a translator. This is how they handle everything. They've just spent hour after hour, day after day, week after week, year after year, memorizing crap. And that's what they're tested on. These are all multiple choice exams. They're an absolute nightmare when you look at them. And that's the universal test. So if you don't go to, what happened by the 1950s, 60s, that's when these became really popular, is that if you were just a regular student and your family couldn't afford, since you're paying for all this, you're paying a lot. If your family can't get you into a juku, they can't afford it, then you're toast. I don't care. You could be Einstein. But since it's all based on memory, not how smart you are, what's going to happen is you're going to get whacked because the folks that you're competing with have generally spent maybe the equivalent of two or double or maybe triple the amount of time you spent constantly repeating, rememorizing stuff to get ready for the exams. So it's just the JUCOs went from being a way to get slightly ahead to basically being a necessity. In modern Japanese society, I can't imagine how you would think you're ever going to get into a university if you haven't been through cram schools. Now, in Chinese society, like I say, the same phenomena takes place, but it's generally, in many cases, is less structured in the sense that it's individuals or something like that. And this actually, what you find is a lot of the folks in the JUCOs, especially for folks, if their students are from kindergarten through say sixth or seventh grade, the folks that are actually the teachers, I use that in quotes, or tutors might be more accurate. And the JUCOs are actually folks that failed getting into the university exams. But if they failed just barely, in other words, they had high scores, but they weren't high enough. So they're actually good examples of the success of the memory JUCO system, but they weren't quite successful enough. So they become a superb source of incredibly cheap tutoring, teachers for the new group of, elementary school students. So there's this whole business model in Japan tied around JUCOs, and these are folks, when it comes to English, these are folks that you bring in from the United States. This would be the JET program, for example, that the Japanese government actually runs, that sends English speakers, and we've had a ton of Chaminade students that have gone through this program, that actually are then, sent over to Japan to teach spoken English, but also to drill Japanese students in English, to give them, more success. And almost invariably, what you find is if you work in the JET program during the day at a school, what happens is the minute you, in fact, even before you arrive in Japan, in most cases, various JUCOs will actually approach you, and they'll hire you to then teach in these tutoring scenarios in after hours. And this is normative, especially if you're teaching English in Japan. So this is the JUCO system. It's a very, very complex system, and in a fairly significant part, depends on those ronin. I mentioned these folks before. These are the folks that failed getting into the university, but unlike the United States or somewhere else where they might have to go off and find a different career, or go say to community college or something like that. What they're going to do is they're basically going to spend another 11 months studying again, in basically a sort of their own version of a JUCO, to then take the exam, the university entrance exams again the next year. So the Japanese educational system is pretty surreal, because basically I would argue the main function of the Japanese educational system is to test ganbatte. It's to test how tough you are, how willing you are to just put your nose to the grindstone and just, bust ass and do what you got to do, because you're competing with everyone else. And again, as I mentioned before, you have to remember, if I'm graduating from a Japanese high school, say the Takayama High School, and so it's time to take the university exams for Nagoya University, I'm not only competing with the other Japanese in my age group, in other words, the folks that graduated from high school this year, I'm also competing with all the ronin that didn't get into Nagoya in the last couple of years that are also competing with me. And they have the advantage that not only have they seen the exam, not the same exam, but they know how the exam works, but also they've now spent another 11 months getting ready for it. But that doesn't increase the number of spots open for entering freshmen. So the Japanese educational system is surreal. You're starting to see a little more and more sort of cracks in this, because this is largely a post-World War II phenomena. And what you're seeing is more as the population of folks, under the age of 30 shrinks. You see more and more folks in that age group, especially in high school, questioning, why, especially as with layoffs, as we'll get into later, with the business collapse of salaryman positions in Japan. And that was the reason that you did all this. If you got into a university, guaranteed you were a good job with a good company for the rest of your life. So, it was like you did all this huge upfront labor from the time you're 4 years old to 18 years old. And then the payoff would be from 19 till 55. And so that's failing rapidly. So if the last part fails, then you got to be asking, if you're 14, it's like, well, why should I bust my ass for another 4 years when I'm not going to get a salaryman job, when I'm not going to have a guaranteed career path, with a good company for the next, 40 years of my life. So, screw this. So what you get is that logic is leading this whole system to sort of crumble. It's not falling apart completely, but it's big cracks in it. And that's creating yet another panic, especially in the Ministry of Education, but also with companies and especially the government in general. Because what do you do? Among other things, jukus are a huge business in Japan. And also to a large part, which happens in a weird way, then if I'm a teacher at a public school, I assume that any of my students that want to get ahead are going to jukus. So to a certain extent, I can spend more time in my class, my regular day, public school class, teaching my students how to socially interact effectively and various other aspects that are important to be Japanese. Because I figure, well, they're going to get the data after school in the cram school. So it sort of changes what I'm expected to teach because the jukus take up a lot of what you might call sort of the grind of a Japanese educational system is actually performed now, voluntarily, I suppose, for lack of a better term, in the juku system. So it means that Japanese educators have a very different job than their American counterparts. So we'll stop there.